continue in the philosophical vein today by looking at three specific and hugely influential philosophers. Plato, doesn't get much more influential than that, St. Thomas Aquinas, and René Descartes. To talk to us about these three great figures from the history of philosophy, we have three great figures from USD's own philosophy department. Addressing Plato's account of truth will be Professor Michael Wagner. Professor Wagner received his PhD from the Ohio State University, and he's been a member of faculty here at USD since 1980. A specialist on Plotinus and on Neoplatonism more generally, his most recent book is The Enigmatic Reality of Time. Great name for a book. Second to speak will be Professor Turner Nevitt. Professor Nevitt received his PhD from Fordham University. He's the author of a number of very important articles on Aquinas, and particularly on Aquinas' account of resurrection, and he's currently engaged in the Herculean task of producing the first English translation of Aquinas' quodlibetal questions. Finally, talking to us about Descartes will be Professor Michelle Grier. Professor Grier received her PhD from UC San Diego and is one of the world's foremost authorities on the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. She is the author of Kant's Doctrine of Transcendental Illusion, and her new book, What Can I Know?, will be published by Routledge later this year. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Drs. Wagner, Nevitt, and Grier. Dr. Wagner will be up here.
Actually, I do have a handout. If people, I'll give some to both sides here. People will kind of circulate it backwards, sideways and backwards, a little bit of a handout. Because I want to do some geometry with you, as you see. Hopefully it'll be clear why. Okay, so Plato on truth. Plato's dialogue, Meno, depicts his mentor Socrates engaged in a discussion with Meno to learn from him the nature of virtue. In the early stages of the dialogue, Meno suggests several answers to Socrates' question, what is virtue? Only to have Socrates criticize and reject each of his answers. Rather than simply acquiescing to Socrates' quibbling, however, Meno sort of calls him out on it. He in effect suggests that perhaps the fault doesn't lie in his answers, but in Socrates' inability to recognize their veracity, which instigates Socrates in turn to introduce an argument he attributes to the sophists. Okay, and that's what those of you who were able to get a handout, that's what's at the top. The argument says, premise one, either you already know something or you don't. If you already know it, then you can't learn it, since learning means coming to know. If you don't already know it, then you still can't come to know it. Therefore, learning, that is coming to know things, is impossible. In the dialogue, Meno's remark leads Socrates to introduce this argument primarily because of its third premise. Why, according to the argument, if you don't already know something, you can't come to know it? The answer to this question seems to lie in a connection between knowing something and recognizing its truth. The argument implicitly distinguishes between simply accepting something as true and, in fact, recognizing that it is true. To know something minimally involves recognizing that it's true. But how can you recognize that something is true if you don't already know it? Okay, I think of our students sitting in classes and listening at instructors babbling on about all kinds of stuff that they're trying to teach them and that they want them to know. And the students have to sort of sit there and think, is that really true? I don't know, is that really true? I guess I can memorize it and regurgitate it on a test, but did I really learn something? Okay, so that's kind of the gist of it. Socrates' response to this argument, though, has him calling over a young slave boy and, in effect, engaging him in a lesson in geometry. Socrates draws a square on the ground, which he stipulates we consider to be 2 units long on each of its sides. And he asks what the area of the 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 square is. Okay, so that's the top picture here. Okay, you've got a square that's 2 units long on each side. And Socrates gets the slave boy to readily recognize that since it's made up of 4 quadrants that are each 1 by 1 squares, it's 4 square units. Okay, well, so far so good. But then Socrates poses to the boy a problem. Can he modify Socrates' drawing so as to produce another square exactly twice the size as the original 4 square unit square? So in other words, twice the size in terms of its area. The boy proposes that the simplest way to do that would be to simply make each side of the square twice as long. And so that's what they do. They take the top of it, that's 2 units, and draws it out to 2 more units, and on the side, the same thing, and then completes the square. Well, however, Socrates gets the boy to recognize that since this 4 by 4 square is actually made up of 4 quadrants, each of which is the size of the original square, the area of this new square is actually 16 square units, whereas twice 4 square units would be 8 square units. Well, what are they going to do? The boy at this point is pretty much muddled, doesn't really have an idea. So Socrates does show him the answer. And what Socrates does is, so this is the bottom square. He takes the 16 square unit square, and through each of its 4 quadrants, he draws a diagonal. And so he creates a new square like that. Okay, now you eyeball that square, and you ask yourself, well, is that square exactly twice the area of that one? Well, I mean, eyeballing it, you probably really can't quite tell. I can't. Okay, but here's the deal. Rationally, you recognize that since each of those diagonals cuts each of those quadrants exactly in half, and each of the quadrants was 4 square units, that means that you end up with a residue of 2 units from each of the 4 quadrants, and that equals exactly 8 square units. Okay, so even if you can't eyeball it, you can rationally recognize that this square here must be exactly twice the size of that, because it must be 8 square units, whereas that bigger square had been 16. Okay. Let's see. Our question, though, is what has Socrates' geometry exercise with the boy demonstrated, and how does it relate to the sophist argument about learning? Here I won't attempt to delve into all the aspects of Socrates' discussion, most especially his resulting proposal that learning is recollection. My interest here is rather in a distinctive feature of the geometry aspect of the exercise itself. If we focus for a minute on Socrates' solution to the problem, one of its features is the fact that we can recognize that the new square inscribed within the 16 square unit square is 8 units because it has to be 8 units, in as much as 1/2 of 16 is 8. And so it cannot be anything other than 8. It is not uncommon in Plato's writings, when he wishes to give an example of something that is true, or which he wishes to demonstrate or prove to be true, for him to give an example of something which is true because, or in the sense that it couldn't be otherwise. Some later philosophers termed truths with this feature, that they couldn't be otherwise, or that they must be true, necessary truths. In these terms, we can perhaps see Socrates responding to the sophist argument by observing that his third premise is inapplicable, at least in the case of necessary truths. Actually, in the dialogue, he never really goes back to the argument and tells us exactly how he thinks of himself as responding to it. But anyhow, philosophers who articulate a concept of necessary truth typically distinguish it from a second kind of truth, often termed contingent truth. Above, I offer 1/2 of 16 is 8 as an example of necessary truth. Consider, though, the statement, "It is raining outside." Is this a true statement? Well, one thing to notice about it, is that whether it's true or not depends, at least in part, on when or where it's asked. Even if it were true, yesterday it would have been, I guess, but even if it were true here and now that it is raining outside, the very same statement might not be true to say tomorrow or if we were in Yuma instead. Okay, so even if here and now it is raining outside, the statement "it is raining outside" is not true because, or in the sense that it could not be false. It could not be otherwise. Okay, now, where do we go with this with Plato? Actually, an important and influential predecessor to Plato in this regard was the philosopher Parmenides. In his philosophy, Parmenides describes what he calls the way of truth. Parmenides' description of his way of truth has, for our purposes, two crucial features. Its first feature concerns the relationship between truth and reality, or what is. The Greek term is ontos. A distinctive feature of the classical Greek concept of truth, aletheia, is what might be termed truth as authenticity. Consider, for example, the true statements, "Joe is a friend of mine," and "Joe is a true friend." Here, perhaps it is indeed the case, as the first statement says, that Joe is a friend, or at least that I think of him as a friend. But characterizing him as not simply a friend, but as a true friend, seems to demand and say something more than that. It implies a sort of completeness or authenticity, in a word, reliableness, or a classical Greek might say perfection, to Joe's friendship, not implied in simply calling him a friend. And indeed, in Parmenides, to characterize a statement or belief as true implies a special status for it, as an attempt to characterize or describe the way things are. A second feature of Parmenides' way of truth, however, is that an attempt to characterize or describe the way things are achieves and merits this special status of being true only when things couldn't be otherwise. In other words, for Parmenides, only necessary truths are authentically true. The second feature of Parmenides' way of truth, however, is where Plato does want to part company with him. Plato agrees with Parmenides that necessary truths are authentically true. In that regard, moreover, he also agrees with another feature of Parmenides' way of truth, namely Parmenides' inference that since necessary truths in fact assert or imply that it is not merely the case that things are that way, but that things must be that way, the reality of what they characterize or describe correspondingly not merely is, but must be. Accordingly, a central feature of Plato's philosophy is that there exists a reality which human language and thought is capable of discerning, which itself is eternal, necessary, and unchanging. For those of you who do study philosophy, that tends to be called his world of the forms. But the key thing is that in addition to the physical sense perception world around us, for Plato, there is a reality that the human mind can discern and discover truth from. And those truths would be necessary truths. Okay. Now, what does Plato have to say, though, about what I characterize as contingent truths? Unfortunately, Plato had very little to say about this in his writing. He does want to say that truths about the world around us can be also authentically true, that when it is raining outside, and I say it's raining outside, that there is an authentic truth to that. But his writings are so preoccupied with the eternal realm as the source of human wisdom and virtue that he says very little about that. His followers in the academy do characterize the world of human experience and physical reality as what they call probable truth. They still want to see that as a genuine kind of truth, but they attribute to contingent statements at most what they call a probability of truth or probable truth. Unfortunately, then they also don't give us very clear criteria for how we kind of distinguish when we achieve that. Okay. Alrighty, so thank you very much.
Okay, Aquinas on truth. So for Aquinas in Latin, as for us in English, truth is an abstract term. It corresponds to the concrete term true. In this sense, truth is like whiteness or heat. Whiteness is an abstract term. It corresponds to the concrete term white. Heat is an abstract term. It corresponds to the concrete term hot. To ask what is whiteness is to ask about white things. What is it that makes them white? What does their being white consist in? What about them constitutes their whiteness? To ask what is heat is to ask about hot things. What is it about them that makes them hot? What does their being hot consist in? What is it for them to be hot? Similarly, for Aquinas, to ask what is truth is to ask about true things. What is it that makes them true? What is it for them to be true? What does it mean for them to be true? And he thinks the answer depends on the things you're talking about, because the word true is used in many different ways. I mean, think of all the different ways that we would say something was true. You can call someone a true friend or a true patriot. You can show someone your true self, the jerk that you really are, or show your true colors, right? You can desire true love or call someone your one true love. A painting can be a true Monet as opposed to a forgery, for example. Lots of different ways that we use the word true, and they don't mean the same thing. In that sense, there are different senses of the word true and thus different kinds of truth. But Aquinas thinks that truth in the primary sense, the sort of focal meaning of truth, is the sense in which beliefs and statements can be said to be true. This is the sense of truth involved when we ask someone to just tell the truth. We mean just make true statements, right? And for Aquinas, he thinks that truth in this sense, in this primary sense, is a matter of what he calls adequation between the mind and reality, or adequation between thoughts and things. So to believe of what is that it is to believe something true. To say of what is that it is to say something true. And its truth consists in its adequation. What is said is adequate to what is. What is believed is adequate to what is. He thinks that this is truth in the primary sense. So, for me to believe that the cat is on the mat is true. That belief is true if the cat really is on the mat. And it's false if the cat isn't on the mat. If the mat is on the cat, for example. To believe that light moves at 186,000 miles per second, or whatever the speed of light is. I don't know. It's just an example. But anyway, super fast, okay, is to believe something true if light indeed moves at that speed. Otherwise, it's to believe something false. And the same is true of the relevant statements. The statements are just used Aquinas thinks, to signify the thoughts or the beliefs. That's the point of the statements, is to state beliefs or thoughts, to communicate the content of your mind to someone else. So for him, the primary sense of truth is in the mind. It's about the truth of the beliefs or the ideas or the thoughts. The statements will be true derivatively insofar as they signify true thoughts, true beliefs, true ideas. And again, their truth, what it means for them to be true, is their adequation to reality. For Aquinas, that is his basic answer about what is truth. He thinks that we can extend this sense of truth to things instead of simply to thoughts and ideas in a number of different ways. So when things are apt to make us believe what is true about them, when they're particularly apt to bring us to the right beliefs about what they are or what they're like, you can say that they're true. So true gold, for example, as opposed to false gold. False gold or fool's gold is gold that makes you think it's gold, but it's not, right? True gold, you could call it true gold because it's apt to make you form the right beliefs about it, as opposed to the wrong beliefs about it. Another sense in which we can extend truth from the mind to things, he thinks, is when the things that we make come out in the way that we intended them to. Our thoughts about how things should be are adequate to the way things actually are. When the things come out as our thoughts intended them to be, then he thinks we can call them true. So you might turn a house into a true home. And that would be to make the house into the home that you meant it to be, right? It corresponds to your own thought. Or if you're making Thanksgiving dinner and you're trying to make a hollandaise, this is an absolutely delicious sauce. You can make a true hollandaise if you can pull it off. It's very difficult. Often the butter and eggs separate and you scramble the eggs, you ruin Thanksgiving dinner. You need a double boiler to do, forget the hollandaise. Anyway, I've had a traumatic experience with hollandaise once in my life, but it was because of an electric stove on which you cannot make hollandaise. Gas stoves are the only appropriate place.
So you got some PTSD.
Clearly, about the hollandaise. But anyway, if the hollandaise comes out the way that you meant it to, the way that you thought that it would, you could say it's a true hollandaise, right? In this sense, Aquinas thinks actually that all things can be called true insofar as they come out the way that God intends. The thought is that God, as the creator of all things, has the thoughts of all things in his own mind. And they are as he thinks they are. Indeed, his thoughts about them are what make them to be, period, and to be what they are and the way that they are. The classic medieval idea was that the knowledge of God is the cause of things, scientia Dei causa rerum, that God's knowledge indeed makes things to be as they are. So Aquinas thinks that all things can be called true in that sense, insofar as they correspond to God's ideas of them. And in that sense, God's ideas can be said to be true as well. God's thoughts about things are true indeed in the most primary sense. They are the most adequate to things. They know things in complete detail and indeed as making them to be as they are. And given the doctrine of divine simplicity, this is the idea that God is what he has, that there's no distinction of parts or properties of any kind in God. Insofar as there is truth in God, that truth must be God by the doctrine of divine simplicity. And so Aquinas reasons that God is indeed truth itself. Okay, so Aquinas' basic idea about truth is that truth is an adequation between the mind and things, between thought and reality. And in that sense, it's a version of the correspondence theory of truth, I guess you would say, as it was presented last week. I think it's importantly different from standard forms of the correspondence theory, but I don't want to get into those weeds. Instead, I want to point out what is perhaps interesting and maybe controversial about this view of truth. It's a very traditional view of truth, actually. Fairly traditional anyway. It's what most philosophers have thought about truth. The coherence theory of truth, the pragmatic theory of truth that we heard about last time, those are new kids on the block, you could say. Correspondence is the old-fashioned view. But it actually sets Aquinas squarely against two common confusions about truth nowadays, which I want to mention and explain a bit. I know that they're common because I hear them every semester from my students when I ask them, what is truth? What does it mean to say that a belief or a statement is true? And I always get the same two answers from them. So what does it mean to call a statement true? What am I saying when I say that the statement, the cat is on the mat, is true? Or that 2 + 2 = 4 is true? What does that mean? The first answer they usually give me is that true statements are those that can be proven. This is the first idea. The true statements or the true beliefs are the ones that can be proved. This definition of truth is false at best. There are lots of things that are true that cannot be proven true. For example, there's no way to prove that Charlemagne's favorite color was magenta. We have no access to the relevant evidence for that, and yet his favorite color either was magenta or it was not. One of those two statements, his favorite color was magenta or his favorite color was not magenta, one of those two statements has got to be true. Again, the Pythagorean theorem was true long before anyone could prove it. At worst, the definition of truth as what can be proven is circular. Because, of course, when you say that it can be proven, you mean that it can be proven true. What else would it mean to prove it except to establish its truth in some way? So this error, or this confusion, I think Aquinas would say, is a confusion between truth and evidence or proof. Evidence is our reasons for thinking that something is true. Proof is how we come to know that something is true. It's the basis on which we can conclude that something is true, but it doesn't constitute or define truth itself. So you have to distinguish between the truth question, is it true, and the evidence or proof question, how do we know that it's true? They're different questions and thus have different answers. The second common confusion I think Aquinas would say about truth nowadays is the idea that true statements are those that everyone agrees on. True statements are those that everyone can agree on. Those are the true statements. And again, I hear this every semester from my students. This definition is false as well. At one time, for example, everyone agreed that the sun orbited the earth, but that didn't make it true. Again, imagine that I convinced everyone here, or maybe everyone in the world, even myself, that I had $1 million in my bank account. The fact that we all agreed about it wouldn't suddenly make the money appear in my bank account. I wish, but that's just not the case. The idea that truth is what everyone can agree on, this is a confusion between truth and falsity and belief and disbelief. This confuses truth with belief. People can believe things that are false. Once people believed that the sun orbits the earth. People can disbelieve things that are true, right? Some people still don't believe that the earth orbits the sun, right? And people can withhold or refuse to believe anything at all, okay? To believe that something is true is different from it being true. Believing something is assenting to a claim, accepting it. Disbelieving something is dissenting from a claim, rejecting it. But accepting or rejecting a claim isn't enough to make it true. Otherwise, you could never be mistaken. Every claim that you believed would be true by definition. Belief is about how people relate to claims, whether they accept them or not. If they accept them, they believe them. If they don't, they don't. But truth is not about how people relate to claims, but about how claims relate to reality, Aquinas would say. The true claims are those claims about reality that actually are adequate to reality. And the false ones are those that are not. Just because I believe something doesn't make it true. I mean, thank God, actually, that we don't live in a world in which whatever people believed was true. You don't want to live in that world. in which whatever anyone else believes is true. What a horrifying notion. This confusion between truth and belief, I think, is also involved in the idea that the very same statement about the same thing could be true for me but not for you, or true for one person but not for another. Again, this is, I think Aquinas would say, just a confusion between truth and belief. When I say that it's true for me, all that means is I believe it. And when I say it's not true for you, all that means is that you don't believe it. But my believing it doesn't make it true. Just like you're not believing it doesn't make it false. Because truth has been diluted in this way, confused with mere belief, it's had to be replaced by a new notion of fact. Recently, someone told me, well, you have to distinguish between truth and fact. You see, things can be true for some people, but not be facts. And of course, all she meant is that people can believe that they're true, but be wrong. In other words, what they believe can be false. It's not true just because they believe it. And the idea that the real difference is made by facts or not is just to have fact doing the work that truth was meant to do all along. It's a confusion between truth and belief. At least I think that's what Aquinas would say. So that's the first part of my talk, the idea that truth is this adequation between the mind and reality. There's another sense of truth that Aquinas has, and I want to say a little bit about it. I've been talking about truth in the sense of what makes things, especially beliefs and statements, true. True in the sense of what makes them true. But Aquinas has another sense of truth, another use for the term truth, which is truth as a virtue. This is not what makes things true, but what makes people truthful, what makes people tell the truth. We would call this virtue honesty, I guess, but Aquinas doesn't have this word, honesty. His word for this virtue is veritas, truth. You could translate it as trueness or truthfulness. We would call it honesty, I guess, but it is what disposes us to tell the truth. It's the virtue of truth-telling, I guess. Aquinas thinks that this virtue is a part of justice. It's about how we relate to others, how we treat other people. And justice, he thinks, is about giving other people their due, giving them what they are owed by rights. And he thinks that we owe each other the truth. And truth, veritas, is the virtue of giving it to each other, giving each other the truth. Why does he think that we're owed the truth? Well, he thinks that we're social animals, that we can't do well without living together. We depend on each other in a whole host of ways in order to flourish. We can't flourish without living together, and we can't live together without believing each other. And I don't mean simply trusting each other. Of course, we can't live together without trusting each other. But I mean that we can't live together without relying on each other for the truth, believing each other in the sense of depending on each other for knowledge of the truth. We can't live together without that. Most of what we know, or most of what we think we know, is actually based on the testimony of other people. We believe it because other people have told us, and we believe them. We trust them. We don't have the evidence for these things ourselves. Even our most scientific beliefs, which we think are the ones that are really proven, really provable, we don't possess the evidence ourselves. We believe scientists. They tell us that the universe is expanding at an increasing rate, and we believe it. We haven't done the relevant experiments to test the red shift and the light, blue shift of light or whatever. We probably haven't even seen a telescope in our lives. Or whatever. You see the point. Most of what we believe based on human testimony. We rely on other people for the truth. And most of what we think we know is based on being told it. And we really could not do anything in our lives, or I mean very little, without believing what people tell us and without relying on them for the truth. And so that's why Aquinas thinks that we need each other in order to do well, and we need each other for the truth. That we can't get to the truth that we need to know in order to live well alone. So we owe each other the truth, and he thinks that truth as a virtue is the virtue of giving each other the truth in this sense. So Aquinas thinks that lying is wrong, and he thinks it's always wrong. But what's interesting, his main reason for thinking so isn't because it hurts other people. He certainly thinks it does. There's an injustice involved in lying to other people. It harms them. But he also thinks that there's a certain injustice done to the words themselves. And this is the last thing that I want to talk about. He thinks that what is really wrong about lying is that it's an abuse of language, that it's an injustice to the very nature and purpose of language, which is for us to share our thoughts with each other. Language is the currency, you might say, by which we can exchange our ideas and our thoughts. It's an institution, like money, and to lie is to intentionally devalue the currency, as it were. It's to weaken the language and make it less capable of doing what we depend on it for, reliably sharing our thoughts with each other. And so he thinks that the real wrong, or perhaps you might say the primary or main wrong in lying, isn't the harm to the other people, but first the harm to the institution of language. It's a kind of devaluing of the currency, you could say, that renders it less capable of doing what we need it for, and indeed what it is for. It's not that Aquinas thinks that expressing our thoughts is all that language is for. He recognizes lots of other uses for language. We use language to make promises, to issue commands. They're not always for sharing our thoughts with each other. But a primary and essential purpose of language is indeed to share our thoughts with each other. It's the primary way that we do that. And you can actually see this by considering the way that lies work. Why do lies work as a form of deception, as a means of deception? They work precisely because they're the exception to the norm for language. We wouldn't believe the lies if it wasn't most often the case that the language is used to tell us the truth. Lies depend on being an exception to that norm for the use of language. That's precisely why they're successful as means of deception. But that also shows that a primary purpose for the language is the communicating of the truth, is the communicating of our ideas. And thus to lie is to use the language in precisely the opposite way that it was intended for. It's to devalue the currency, you could say, in which we exchange our ideas. So that, he thinks, is the problem, or one of the primary problems, you could say, with lying. Okay, last point. Just as Aquinas thinks that God is truth in the first sense, that God is the primary source of the truth of things, and God's ideas are true in the most primary sense, and indeed God is to be identified with truth itself, he also thinks that God is truth in this second sense of the virtue of truth. God is supremely truthful. As the source of all virtues and all truthfulness, God is supremely truthful. God cannot lie and only speaks the truth, Aquinas thinks. And this is why he thinks that we can believe and trust revelation. If God tells you something, you can believe it because God is supremely truthful. As Aquinas' beautiful Eucharistic hymn says, "What God's Son has told me, take for truth I do. Truth itself speaks truly, or there's nothing true." Thank you.
Thanks to the gentlemen, my philosophical brothers. It is many years now that I have come to realize that many of the things that I took to be true in my childhood turned out to be false. This is the predicament articulated by René Descartes in one of his most influential works, the Meditations on First Philosophy, published in 1641, second edition in French in 1642. All right? René Descartes is a modern, by which I mean an Enlightenment philosopher. And as I said, I'm gonna focus on very briefly some of his claims from the Meditations. Great segue for me. To understand what Descartes is concerned about, it is helpful to understand the historical context in which Descartes was writing. Descartes is, as a modern philosopher, dealing with some conceptual shifts in worldview from the medieval or the scholastic period, right? According to, guess what? Lots of things happened since Aquinas and Plato. Whereas on the medieval or scholastic worldview, the universe was conceived as a finite and perfectly ordered, beautifully ordered whole, with the earth, and therefore man, at the center, and the sun and the other heavenly bodies revolving around it. Right? Suddenly, many of those typical or views had come to be challenged. The medieval worldview was really a precarious synthesis of Aristotelian metaphysics and a biblical account of human existence and creation. But that view came to be challenged due to a number of developments, not just in the sciences and in mathematics, right? Also with the European explorations, with technological advances in terms of the development or the development of the microscope and the telescope, right? And so what we had was this transition to a scientific worldview that was challenging the medieval or scholastic worldview. Suddenly, the example you gave is perfect. Let's just talk about Copernicus, shall we? Right? What the previous view was that the earth was at the center of the universe and the heavenly bodies rotated around the earth. But Copernicus ventured an hypothesis that in fact the earth revolved around the sun. Blasphemy! Oh no, you didn't. The Bible didn't tell you that. Blasphemy! Right? But when it was proved by Galileo, who got a little bit in trouble from the church, right? Got a little bit in trouble for proving the Copernican hypothesis. And when many of the other traditional views were becoming challenged, and it was radical. I guess it would be like how fast our, technological revolution happened now. What came to happen is that the views traditionally upheld and codified and proven by the scientists of the time and by the priests and the church came to be called into question. It is many years now since I have come to realize, says Descartes, that the things that I took to be true in my childhood have turned out to be false. And we can all recognize this kind of disillusionment now as we get older and older. Believe me, young'uns, it happens over and over again. You become disillusioned to find that some of the things you previously took to be true turned out to be false. I don't want to burst any bubbles, but Santa Claus, Tooth Fairy, right? But when Descartes says this, speaking in a meditative form, he's speaking for the intellectual European community, right? We used to think we knew that the earth was at the center of the universe. We knew it. We used to know, by the way, that if you want to talk about heat, that something is hot or cold depending on the presence of a mysterious fluid called caloric, whence the word calorie. If you had a lot of caloric, it was hot. You didn't have very much caloric, it was cold. We now think that heat means molecular kinetic energy. What Descartes is really grappling with is the problem that comes from the fact that we're in a predicament now, and we always are, and he hopes maybe not always will be. We're in a predicament now where we ask ourselves, if what we all knew to be true, the scientists told us, the priests told us, the Bible told us, our mommies told us, our daddies told us, everyone knew it to be true, turned out to be false, what makes us think that what we now take to be true, the status of science now, Big Bang, is going to turn out to be true? Descartes' meditations are devoted to an attempt to provide a foundation for certainty, right? And he does accept a kind of correspondence theory of truth. Descartes believed that there was a mind-independent absolute reality out there, and that our beliefs and our judgments would be true, just in case they corresponded to, accurately mapped onto, defined, right? The true nature of things. His method, however, is unique, because in order to try to discover what could be certainly known, we might need to find out that which could never possibly ever turn out to be false. And thus, Descartes commences by a method which involves doubt and skepticism. What he wants to do is to say, I'm going to take my beliefs, I'm going to take my judgments, but I'm not going to accept any one of them if there was any conceivable circumstance under which that belief could turn out to be false. This links up with what Dr. Wagner was calling necessary truths. Couldn't be otherwise. But Descartes wants to say that we can arrive at those truths by a process of elimination through a method of doubt, also known as Cartesian hyperbolic doubt. The first meditation is devoted to showing, much to our dismay, that everything, it turns out, everything in general can be doubted. Everything in general. How does he show it? Who has the time for that? I believe my name's Michelle, believe my daughter's in Chicago, it's sunny outside, take me forever, and I'm finite. Descartes divides our beliefs or our judgments into two kinds, each grounded in their own foundation: sensations and reason, pure reason, right? So let us take the first kind of belief. Beliefs grounded in just what we feel to be justified by sensation and experience. I believe that it's sunny outside. I believe that today is Tuesday. Whatever. Well, I guess I can doubt it. All kinds of beliefs that I have grounded in my sensation and in my experience. And Descartes says, guess what? Anything you believe on the basis of sensation and experience can be doubted and should be rejected because it could turn out to be false later on, and that's what we want to avoid. But there are certain things that seem, even on a sensory basis, to be without question, that I'm standing here now in this room looking at you, and what should have been a paper that I prepared true but unfortunate, okay? How could I doubt that I'm standing here now, that I am here now? Can it be doubted? Yes, of course it can. Descartes introduces one of the most influential arguments in the history of philosophy, the dream argument. It turns out that I can even doubt what seems to be indubitable, that I'm standing here now looking at you. How could I doubt it? I must be a madman, he says. But for the fact that I have dreamt, and in my dreams I have had experiences, sensory, immediate experiences of, I call them nightmares, standing in front of a room where I'm talking to people, right? Which seem just as real as this. And if there's no way to distinguish clearly and distinctly the experiences that I have in dreams from the experience, the sensory experience I'm having now, it's possible that it could turn out to be false. There goes sensation, there goes experience. What's left? Reason. Maybe I could go along with Plato. right?
Geometry.
Yeah, maybe I could go with mathematics. Because even if my senses are deceptive, even if I can't trust my experiences and my sensations, certain immutable, eternal truths, like mathematical truths, couldn't be doubted just by saying, don't trust your senses. Clearly, there is the basis for a foundation for knowledge in reason alone, but for the fact that Descartes introduces probably even a more influential argument, the demon hypothesis. Isn't it possible that you could have been created rather than by an omnibenevolent, omniscient, right? All-powerful God, maybe an all-powerful demon who has created you in such a way so that you, precisely in order to make you deceived. In which case you can't even trust that 2, this is his example, 2 plus 3 equals 5. Pfft, you can doubt that, easy, easy. Now a lot of people want to say maybe, especially students like, the demons, dreaming, that's so metaphysically bizarro. But think of it this way. The demon hypothesis is really just proposing the following. Isn't it possible that we, and therefore you, have been so constituted, or are so constituted, either by creation or chance, evolution, coincidence, that we are so constituted as to be incapable ever of arriving at the truth? Why do we think we have that possible capacity? This is Descartes' problem at the end of the first meditation. He ends up with the possibility that, the claim that everything in general can be doubted. And now, if you look at the beginning of the second meditation, you read little Descartes, and he's sitting in his little jammies and his nightgown and his slippers. Yesterday's meditation put me in such a state of confusion that I can no longer find my way from the bottom to the surface of the water. I feel that I am tumbling. I always tell students, anyone here go surfing? You know what that feels like. He's disoriented. What Descartes does is he introduces a new method, a standard for arriving at truth. And for him, the truth that he's truth is has to do with a correspondence theory of truth. I will have a belief or a proposition. It will be true just in case it corresponds to mind-independent reality. How do I get there? Can't use the body. Dream argument. Can't use reason. Demon hypothesis. I'm unfortunate. But Descartes finds that, in fact, there is a criterion for truth, and that what we need to get from the subjective sphere of belief, right, to move from our beliefs, of course I can believe, as Descartes himself, I could believe that I'm the king, right? But it might not be true. We can believe that the earth revolves around the sun. We can believe in a Big Bang or theory of evolution. The question is, how can we know that what we believe is true? He comes up with a criterion of clarity and distinctness. And he finds within himself that whatever he can clearly and distinctly perceive must be true. How does he do it? Through something called, in the second meditation, a cogito argument. Because it turns out that even if my senses are deceptive, everything that I believe could turn out to be false, whether it be sensation or even maybe if 2 plus 3 could turn out not to be 5, there's one thing that even stands up to this demon hypothesis, and that is the knowledge of my own existence. I think, therefore I am. And he doesn't raise his fist. This is me kind of being theatrically, enacting it. Let he deceive me who will. He can never bring it about that I am nothing, so long as I think that I am something. And with this fundamental truth, he thinks, certainty, he proceeds to build here, to begin to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, to try to formulate an entire new foundation, on the basis of this foundation, a new theory of knowledge, one which will not be able to be susceptible to future falsity. I think, therefore I am. And thus he commences his project. It is the project of modern philosophy in the Enlightenment period. Descartes is the father of modern philosophy. Whether his project succeeds or doesn't is something I guess this series will investigate from now on. So there you go. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I've always had a problem with these very basic fundamental truths that are very abstract. And my problem is that if they're beyond kind of our understanding, you take the tack that we're illuminated by others, whether that is like our teacher or God or even the ideas. They illuminate us. Therefore, we somehow come to understand it because we see being bathed in this illumination. Or whether these very abstract ideas are actually not real in this sense. They're real in terms of ideas, and they're more like aspirations that we will strive for there, understanding that we will never get there, but nonetheless it pulls us. So does it shine on us, or does it pulls us to these to its destiny? Even though we will never get there, we will come ever closer to whatever it is. So what do you? Any of you had something to say about whether it's illumination or aspiration?
Well, I mean, I guess what I can try to add to that is that certainly in the Platonic tradition, you actually tend to get kind of two sub-traditions that tend to develop. Okay, so as I mentioned, one of the things that people who study knowledge and truth in Plato and his academy, struggle with trying to find any clear ideas there when it comes to the physical world or the world of sense experience and so forth. His focus is so much on the idea of spiritual and universal and eternal truth as the basis for virtue and wisdom and so forth. And indeed, he establishes this idea that implies a kind of reality that transcends the everyday world that we think we live in and that we're actually discerning. But that tends to develop in a couple of different ways in his followers. In some ways, what is sometimes called the mystical tradition does view the human mind as indeed, you use the idea of being drawn by illumination towards these higher truths, towards these higher ideas and principles, and you get that very much indeed in the mystical tradition that this reality actually sort of draws us towards it as it illuminates us. But then you do have another tradition which which is a little bit skeptical. It sort of recognizes the idea of that kind of reality and that human nature has an aspiration towards it. But as you suggest, that all we can ever do is aspire, towards some higher or deeper understanding of it. Of course, what are the criteria for that? That can be very unclear, true, right? As Descartes says, even if there is a higher reality, it could be a deceiving evil demon, so far as we know. and we might be really, even us who think we have divine aspiration and illumination might really be getting screwed. I know so. But you do have both of those ideas in the Platonic tradition. That the higher realm, which in the Christian Platonic tradition indeed comes to imply an identification of truth with God, as both an illuminator and also something that in some ways we can aspire to. I don't.
I would just say, very generally, the Enlightenment tradition certainly does consider there to be a project or a task of achieving illumination or enlightenment. That is a project. Descartes thought he gave you the manual. Here, just read my meditations. I'm going to show you how to avoid error to get to that point. A lot of the answer to your question might be the ways in which we distinguish between, or find or identify limitations to human knowledge and understand whether or not human knowledge is essentially limited or if it has an ultimate capacity to achieve that. So, in the German, idealist tradition, knowledge is an ongoing project. And we are called upon. So somebody like Kant would argue in that way. But I don't know if they'd say that you should trust, like the little people, like your friends. I mean, it's a little, like, Descartes was like, Descartes already had doubted that there was any other human beings beside himself. In fact, Descartes denied and rejected in the first meditation the existence of an external world or anything at all, even that he had a body. And so for him, he couldn't, by his procedural method, rely on a collective or intersubjective criterion. But certainly, I suppose other traditions do. Certainly, just in speaking in behalf of Descartes, you can't do that. It's enlightenment means, as Kant said, having the courage to use your own reason and not to believe what the authorities have told you or anybody else. Use your own reason. Whether or not that works.
Well, certainly, Kant, you mentioned Kant, right? I mean, certainly Kant is very well known, or at least attributed, this idea that human knowledge is an ongoing process that can only reach closer and closer approximations.
Approximate the maximum.
To reality or truth.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's mind dependent from a human standpoint. What we're talking about, all three of these traditions, including Descartes, truth is not, and absolute reality is not mind dependent. And that's where skepticism and that's where the problem comes in. How do we get there from here? But all of the philosophers we talk about think that there's an absolute objective reality and that it is mind independent, and our epistemological task is to go out there and get it, to go out there and find it. Later in philosophical traditions, that assumption became challenged, that perhaps reality itself is in some ways, in Kant's case, transcendentally, mind dependent. So I don't know if you have anything to say from Aquinas' point of view.
Aquinas certainly rejects the doctrine of divine illumination as a theory of knowledge of its nature and origins. Augustine accepts the theory of divine illumination and thinks that we need a special supernatural help in order to know anything. I'm not talking about faith here. He thinks that in order to know that 2 + 2 = 4, we need a special divine assistance come to know that. That's Augustine's view, and in that sense, he's in continuity with this, what
Platonic
Dr. Wagner
tradition,
called
yeah.
the mystical Platonic tradition, where
Right.
knowledge really has to come down from above, right? In that sense, it's not that, you go out to get it. It comes down to get you, as it were. It pours itself into your mind. Aquinas rejects that. He's happy to use language of illumination and even divine illumination because of the tradition that he accepts, but he does not actually think that there's a special divine or supernatural light shining in our minds when we know things. Instead, he thinks that our minds contain a natural light which is sufficient to know things as they are. He thinks that God has created us with minds that are capable of knowing things without further special divine assistance. And so he rejects the doctrine of divine illumination as a theory of knowledge. In that sense, he looks fairly naturalistic or rationalistic by comparison to someone like Augustine. It isn't God doing all the work for Aquinas as it is for Augustine. Aquinas thinks that we can come to know things on our own, and that indeed we do so. He doesn't think that we can come to know everything, though, and that's where faith comes in. He thinks that there are lots of things that we simply could not know. If we were working on our own, we would never get there. We could never find out certain things. And so if we're going to know them, someone who knows has got to tell us. And that's what he thinks faith is about. It's about believing God about the things that only God could possibly know. And so the only way that you could possibly come to know them is by relying on divine testimony to know them.
Descartes kind of like that. He has the light of reason.
Yeah, yeah,
And the modern tradition
Sure.
is
Yeah.
really trying to
Yeah.
free yourself from,
Yeah.
dogma and superstition in order to use your own reason. He does have the innate ideas, we
Sure.
have a light of
Yeah.
reason, but we
Yeah.
could proceed and are enjoined to.
yeah. The image of light or illumination to picture knowledge is an ancient one, but we still use it. I mean, we talk about the light bulb going off, or something like that. We still use light as an image for coming to know something, and so Aquinas is happy to use that image of illumination. And since he thinks everything comes from God, he thinks that in that sense, even the natural light of our minds comes from God. But he doesn't think that it comes especially from God or directly from God. It's just that God created our minds. As it were, God made light bulbs and then gave them to us, or something like that. But it isn't like we need God to shine a special light. We've got the bulbs. Brian, you had a question?
Yeah, it's no reason to be reminded of the dream argument in Descartes. I think it's that sort of haunting thing that got me, first of all, interested in philosophy. Now, I'm still tormented by it. I'm really tormented. This is a matter for my therapist rather than for another philosopher. Descartes' solutions seem so sort of hopeless. And why I'm still so tormented by it, I still find myself often uncannily feeling this feels, I don't know whether this is a dream or not. Do you ever find anyone who resolved that issue to your satisfaction, any of you? So we could be confident that we were actually awake? I never found anything, but
Well, don't look for Schopenhauer on that one.
I mean, anything you come up with is going to be, could be a dreamed criterion. But it's like dreams are incoherent and illogical. I could wake up and say, I had a strange dream. I was talking about the criterion for distinguishing between dreams and waking life, and it's that dreams are incoherent and illogical. What a bizarre thing to dream. So I don't know, I always thought we're sort of still lost, but please enlighten me.
Speaking, in behalf of Descartes' position, it's important to note that the dream argument really doesn't become overcome in the sense that Descartes never, even by the sixth meditation, gives us back sensation and experience as a form or foundation for knowledge. What he gets back after the third meditation, first, it's a little detour, you got to prove God exists and God's not a deceiver to try to get rid of the demon. But, so you get math and so on back and a priori necessary truths.
You get the existence of the physical world.
Yes,
But
corporeal.
whether you're ever awake to experience it.
Corporeal nature in general, but you can, but the related question would be this. I mean, what you get is the existence of corporeal nature in general, which is basically a plenum, understandable in terms of geometry and mathematics. It's not like this crap, you know. That's, you never get that back, but. He thinks you can get back. What you can do is ultimately rely on or ground knowledge claims in the deliverances of pure reason if you believe that he overcame the demon hypothesis. But Brian, maybe you, like some of us, think maybe Descartes never really even got out of his own argument. The demon hypothesis, I mean, think of Schopenhauer. The demon hypothesis was so powerful an argument, it's called the Cartesian circle. Like, he never gets out of it. He's trapped. So he thinks he got out of it, but a lot of people go, demon, you never got out of the demon. It's sad.
The Matrix. We're all in the Matrix. And
You know, for those of you who are aware, there was a book years ago published, Descartes and the Matrix.
Yeah.
Right? There's a book.
Can I just say, since so many of you are looking at us as if we're insane, I'll just say that I disagree with my colleagues. Now, this is not Aquinas. He never considered the dream hypothesis, although he did consider the demon argument. Descartes didn't make that up. He took it
Correct.
from
True.
he took it from late medieval philosophers, women philosophers actually, Saint Catherine of Siena and
True.
others. But the idea that demons could affect our thoughts and beliefs and our cognition was a medieval idea. I mean, it's usually the whipping post, right? They believed in demons, you know, and now we know about germs and all this. But anyway, the demon hypothesis is a medieval idea. It isn't a modern one. But Aquinas does discuss that, and it's interesting what he has to say about the way that demons could mess with our minds, but he doesn't consider the dream hypothesis. So I can't speak for Aquinas on the dream hypothesis, but I can at least say for myself that I could never generate even the least bit of doubt for myself that I might be sleeping right now. So I would just like to submit that there is a sane person sitting up here. Really, the dream hypothesis never had any life for me at all. I have never thought that it is even remotely possible that I might be dreaming right now.
You're like John Locke.
I'm like
How
John
vain,
Locke.
I say. How vain it is to
Well-
pretend to be able to think we might be dreaming when
I-
anybody knows they're not. You're an empiricist. How can you be an empiricist?
I think you're misunderstanding the point of the dream. I think you're misunderstanding the point of the dream hypothesis, dream argument, though Turner. The dream argument really isn't about whether any of us can ever subjectively feel reliable certainty that indeed we are awake. Even though sometimes when we wake up in the morning from a vivid dream, we might for a few minutes not be so sure. But it's not about our subjectivity. The dream argument is about the discovery in early modern science that sensation and sensory images occur in the brain and are analogous to dreams. And how can what we simply access in our brain, in our visual cortex, how can we ever be certain that that maps onto reality and that gives us reality? I mean, that's the point of the dream argument.
Yeah.
So I'm asking sort of a related question to Brian's question. I think that this relates to the question of our ability as human beings to reach something that is, you know, somehow objectively true. And I think back to Plato's choice of Parmenides over Heraclitus. So Parmenides is somebody who thought that reality was fixed, unchanging, and Heraclitus thought that change was the standard, the measure of reality. And so if Plato had chosen Heraclitus as the measure of reality, and a way to talk about God way of thinking wouldn't be very different. And so the thing that I keep coming back to is I don't know if human beings are capable of ascending to a fixed, static, absolute that they wanted to aspire to. I'm thinking Heraclitus might have been the better choice in that sense, especially given all of the scientific developments, theory of relativity, et cetera, in the 20th century. So basically, there's this sense in which it sort of started with Plato's, confidence that reality was fixed, immovable, eternal, unchanging, and that human beings had the ability to get to that. But if it's not, then all of this beautifully done presentations, I'm wondering, maybe we're
Well,
going to the
I think that's one of the interesting things about our intellectual history is that, on the one hand, modern science wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for the Platonic idea that the language of empirical knowing is mathematics. If it wasn't for mathematics, we wouldn't have modern science. And Platonism is responsible for the mathematics throughout modern science. On the other hand, you're exactly correct. You look at where has modern science led us, including within physics and so forth. So yeah, it's a very fascinating intellectual history. So yeah, thank you.